Berlin, Germany, 4 days without power. The longest blackout since 1945. Spain, 43 people dead in a train collision. Warnings had been raised months before. And in Ukraine, 400 settlements in the dark, temperatures at -20. 3 different countries, 3 different causes, the same question. What should we have been paying attention to? Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Crisis Lab podcast. I'm Kyle, and I'll be your host. And 1 month into 2026, and crisis management professionals are already drowning, not necessarily in crises themselves, but in information about them. So today we're talking about the difference between signal and noise, and why discernment might be the most important skill that you develop this year. So let me start with those 3 stories that I mentioned earlier. Berlin, arson attacks severed critical power cables, plunging an estimated 45,000 households into a 4-day blackout, the longest power outage in the city since 1945. Investigators found that the attack destroyed not only the main supply cables, but also the grid redundancy capacity at this single junction point. And so that made rapid restoration largely impossible. Spain, 2 passenger trains collide near Ademuz in Andalusia, killing at least 43 people. Back in August 2025, the train drivers' union had sent a letter to the rail operator warning that track vibrations were causing infrastructure stress. They requested speed reductions. And the investigation, of course, continues. Officials are determining whether a broken rail joint was the cause or the consequence of the derailment. And then we transition to Ukraine, where Russian strikes reduced the country's power generation to 14 gigawatts. Now, comparatively speaking, that's barely a third of the peacetime capacity. And so with temperatures at -20 Celsius and 400 settlements without power, the systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure continues into its 3rd winter. 3 different countries, 3 different causes: sabotage exploiting infrastructure vulnerabilities, safety concerns raised before tragedy struck, and deliberate military targeting of civilian systems. Yet for the communities affected, the downstream reality is identical. It's darkness, it's cold, systems that were supposed to protect them failing when needed. But here's the thing, those 3 stories, they're competing for your attention right now alongside dozens of others. Scroll through any feed and you'll find all 3 stories competing for attention alongside dozens of others. Drone incursions over European airports, AI-generated disinformation campaigns, supply chain disruptions rippling through pharmaceutical networks, climate projections that keep getting revised upward. There's also FEMA restructuring proposals, NATO exercise schedules, and new threat frameworks and updated resilience standards that are being published every week. And so the volume of information is relentless. And the question that a lot of people are not asking is what actually matters here. And so we spent 2025 at Crisis Lab with our newsletter diagnosing largely what's broken. We traced how governance failures turn manageable problems into catastrophes, and we documented how emergency management systems built for discrete events collapse under sustained pressure. We watched the gray zone become the operating environment we live in now. But not a temporary disruption, but a permanent condition. We introduced the velocity of crisis and showed how cascades move faster than institutions can respond. All of that analysis contributed to a secondary problem, which was information overload makes it harder to know what actually deserves our attention. Too big of a problem and nowhere to start. This is the paradox of crisis management in 2026. The more we understand about interconnected threats, the more overwhelming the landscape becomes. Every incident connects to others. Every vulnerability links to systems. Every signal gets lost in the noise of everything else demanding attention. The emergency manager monitoring developments this January and February doesn't lack information. They're buried in it. The challenge isn't access, it's discernment. What deserves our focus? What can be safely ignored? What looks like noise but is actually signal that we need to pay attention to, and what looks like signal but is actually a distraction. So let's go back to those 3 incidents, because when you strip away the specifics, something else emerges. One pattern. Look again at January and February's headlines, strip away the specifics, and a pattern emerges. Berlin wasn't attacked by a sophisticated adversary. with advanced capabilities. It was attacked by someone or a group who understood that a single junction point fed an entire district. The vulnerability was structural. Efficiency optimized at the expense of redundancy. The attack didn't overcome strong defenses, it exploited the absence of them. Spain's train collision is still under investigation, and the cause remains undetermined, but the August 2025 letter still exists. Union officials raised concerns about track conditions and requested speed limits to be reduced. Whether those warnings related to this specific stretch of track or whether the crash had different causes entirely, the investigation will ultimately determine. What we know now is that warnings existed and 43 people are dead. Ukraine's infrastructure destruction is deliberate military targeting, categorically different from the other two, of course. But the communities managing minus 20 temperatures with 14 gigawatts of generation capacity face the same operational reality as Berlin residents in their fourth day without power. Systems designed for normal conditions are failing under stress with no cavalry coming to restore what we deem normal anytime very quickly. And so what's the pattern here? Because there is one, and the pattern isn't the cause per se. It's in what the causes reveal about where attention should have been focused before each incident became a crisis. Berlin needed infrastructure redundancy, not better threat intelligence. Spain needed institutional structures that could evaluate safety warnings and act on them if warranted. Ukraine needs the war to end, of course, but short of that, its survival depends on distributed generation, community-level resilience, and the kind of self-sufficiency that European civil defense planners are now just rediscovering and considering. So in each case, the signal that mattered was structural. The noise was everything else. So what does this mean for you? What should you actually be paying attention to this year? If 2025 was about diagnosis and we're looking at our problems and complexities, then 2026 has to be about discernment. The threats are not going away. Gray zone operations will continue probing civilian systems. Climate-driven disasters will keep arriving faster and harder than before, and institutional capacity will remain strained over the long term. The velocity of crisis will continue to outpace the speed of coordination and decision-making. So accepting this as the operating environment, rather than hoping for a return to something more manageable, changes what deserves attention. So what does that look like in practice? Start with single points of failure in critical systems. Berlin's blackout targeted one junction, not because it was the only vulnerability, but because it was sufficient. Every system has these points. Most organizations don't know where theirs are, so it's time to revisit that conversation. Finding them before adversaries or accidents do is the signal we're looking for. But then there's the noise. Threat briefings without operational implications. Knowing what that drone's violated airspace somewhere in Europe doesn't help unless it changes what you do on Monday morning. Awareness without action is noise dressed up as vigilance. Another signal worth watching, warnings that exist but may not be reaching decision makers. The union letter that was sent in August, the Spanish investigation will determine whether those warnings were relevant to the crash, but someone in your organization is raising concerns about something right now. The question isn't whether warnings exist, it's whether institutional structures allow them to become action before they become evidence. And on the noise side, new frameworks that repackage old approaches. The emergency management field produces frameworks like factories produce widgets. Most add complexity without adding capability. If a new approach doesn't change root cause behavior, then it's likely falling into that noise category and not signal. Here's a signal that matters more than most. Self-sufficiency metrics. How long can your community, organization, or your household function without external support? This was the question we posed in an article about measuring against the wrong thing. It remains the question that matters the most, not the response time, not coordination efficiency, survival duration. And the noise that often gets mistaken for progress are the metrics that measure activity rather than capability. So exercise conducted, plans updated, training hours logged, all necessary, none sufficient. If the metrics don't tell you whether you can actually survive when systems fail, they're measuring the wrong thing. Now here's the hard part. How do you actually build this capability? And this is where we enter into the discernment discipline. So separating signal from noise isn't a skill that comes naturally. It requires deliberate practice and increasingly deliberate community. The professionals adapting best to gray zone reality aren't working in isolation. They're building networks that help them filter what matters from what merely demands attention. They're engaging across sectors because the most important signals often come from outside their own domain. They're investing in relationships that provide context, the kind of context that turns raw information into actionable understanding. So this is one of the reasons we built the forum at Crisis Lab, not to add more content to already overflowing feeds, but to create a space where senior professionals can think together about what actually matters, where the peer who's dealt with infrastructure resilience in one context can help you see the signal you're missing in yours, where the constant pressure to respond to everything gets replaced by the discipline of focusing on what counts. And so here's the bottom line. January 2026 and going into February this year has already shown us that the dynamics that we've documented through 2025 aren't just theoretical, they are operational. The question for the year isn't whether a crisis will arrive. It most certainly will. It's whether we will have the discernment to see what matters before it becomes unavoidable. And I think that's the key as we move into 2026 and the year ahead. So thanks for listening. Subscribe to the Crisis Lab newsletter at news.crisislab.io and to join in the conversation. And if you're a senior professional looking for that peer community to have these types of discussions that we talked about, then go check out the forum. And so that's over at crisislab.io. And until next time, stay safe and we'll be in touch.